Joining me now is Xilonin Cruz-Gonzalez from the California Board Association to discuss the future of public schools and how they're holding up during this shutdown. Xilonin, thanks for joining us. Governor Newsom's May budget review, it's due this week. Explain what that process is and what it could mean for California schools and students. I'm a parent of two, so I'm really wondering what's going to be happening.
Sure. So the way the budget process works, in January, the governor releases a proposed budget. And then normally after taxes get filed in April and the state starts seeing what the budget's going to look like, he releases what's called the May revision, the May revise, this week. It normally happens this week. But because of all the extraordinary things happening, he is going to be releasing a May revise this week, but he's already hinted and let people know that the numbers are going to be drastically reduced in terms of the budget. And that's going to have a direct effect on our schools because our schools are primarily funded through the state budget.
Can you tell us what kind of news you may have expected if this outbreak never had happened and what you're anticipating now that it did happen? What do you think you're going to hear?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the economy was going strong, but the reality is for school districts, funding, we were still facing funding crunches. So when you look at school funding across the country, California is really funded at 38 out of 50 states. And so even going into this crisis, you had many districts across the state that were already looking at budget cuts into the upcoming year. And so now thinking about facing cuts and increases in costs related to implementing social distancing, physical distancing, I think I think we're a little scared to see what comes out this week.
Yeah, there's a lot of changes for sure, and we really don't know exactly what to expect. Do you think there's going to be an immediate impact on education? And what about repercussions when schools do reopen?
Yeah, so I mean, I think budgets are always a matter. There are choices when it comes to budgets. So I think we're actually hopeful, and we're asking, and hopefully our communities are asking the state to continue funding education at least the level before this crisis happened. But I think it's really unknown, and the reality is if we don't get that funding that we need to see, I think it's going to have a direct impact on how we think about how schools will come back next fall. Meaning, really, if the funding's not there to ensure that we can make sure everyone is safe, I think that we've already had some districts like big districts like LA Unified and San Diego say that if there are funding cuts as anticipated, that they're not going to come back in person next year.
Well, you say hopeful, which is good. We want to stay positive. What is the best outcome that you think we can hope for?
Yeah, so I mean, the state does have a significant reserve, although I think it pales in comparison to the budget shortfall that's being said. I think that we're hoping that the state will not fund education based on the formula that they usually use, but based on the need. And then the other big unknown factor is that we really hope that between ourselves and the state that we really advocate at the federal level to make sure that they fund education as well, because that can actually help us backfill a lot of these shortfalls.
A lot of questions around education. This is a big one. A lot of parents are probably thinking about this. Is there a plan to coordinate the reopening of schools at a state, county, and local level? Will schools across the state all at once, when every county says it's okay, or will it happen in bits where they can reopen and the districts decide, are they ready? Usually it's, each district, but is this going to be more of a statewide effort? What can we expect?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty clear by now that schools are not going to be coming back this year. And even as we go into next year, as it is right now, not all school districts open at the same time, right? So I think you're not going to see every district opening at the exact same date. But I do think districts, from my understanding right now, are intending to keep the same reopening dates, return to school day that they have. I think the greatest unknown is about how that's going to look, whether all kids are just going to go back to normal like we used to go, whether there's some kind of hybrid approach. I mean, those are the things that right now are being planned out, and our hope is that at the state level they have a current task force that they're going to develop these guidelines that we're going to be able to use regionally to plan that rollout, that return.
Yeah, I can only imagine what's going on behind the scenes as all these education officials, administrators try to figure out what it's going to look like, what's the best. I was talking with a girlfriend of mine who is a counselor at a public school, and this is what I'm talking about, the expectations. What is the earliest that we can realistically expect schools to reopen, and what decisions have to be made before that can happen? I know you said, they want to try and open as scheduled, but what's realistic at this point?
Yeah, so I think, first ones, I think most of us are eagerly awaiting what comes out of this task force from the state to give guidance in terms of what does physical distancing look like in schools, and what does that mean in terms of how we're going to implement return to schools. The second piece is really around ensuring that we have the funding to be able to do those pieces, whether it's making sure kids are separated, making sure that we're able to clean and sanitize all of our facilities. So those are the pieces that are going to go into it. I mean, obviously, I think as districts, we want to make sure that we let families know those concrete plans as soon as possible. But I think at least in the interim, the more transparent and the more we can communicate about what we do know, I think is really the course of action. In terms of your second piece about how realistic are we going to go back, the answer is I really don't know. But we see other countries going back to school already, and so I hope we can learn from those lessons so that we can go back quickly as well.
That's good advice. We just have to really stay flexible right now. Now, what about resources? What are the resources that are going to be necessary for schools to possibly reopen as early as this summer?
Yeah, so and I can't really quantify that. I think it's really, and I wish that I could have a dollar amount. But obviously, I think it's going to be more expensive if you think about all of the costs associated with cleaning schools and making sure that if we have to have PPE, right, the personal protective equipment, I think those are additional expenses. Also, just figuring out how can we make sure that kids can stay apart from each other. Right now, we have classrooms with like 30 kids or more in a class, right? How are we going to make sure that there's fewer kids in a class so that we can, if you've been in a classroom, if you're a parent, 30 kids in a classroom cannot be 6 feet apart from each other, right? So those are some of the questions we need to answer and figure out.
You mentioned PPE, and when we talk about precautions and protections, what do you think we're going to need for students and staff? Are we talking about masks and gloves on campus in the classrooms?
That's what we're seeing in other countries. I mean, if you see some of the pictures coming out from other countries, that's what we're seeing. And it's kind of hard to imagine. I have a 5-year-old to see him keeping a mask on all day long, but I think that's maybe where we're going. I would say in terms of that, I think we've seen the struggle in terms of local jurisdictions trying to get PPE. The message really needs to be that if we're going to do this, it has to be a state procurement process, right? So that districts are not out there trying to find this on their own, like we're seeing right now happening in the health sector.
Xilonin Cruz-Gonzalez from the California School Boards Association. I want to thank you for joining us and answering some of these education questions. Like I said, I'm a parent. Every day I'm just waiting to hear what's going to happen, but I also realize I've got to manage those expectations, and there's a lot of good folks working behind the scenes to try and keep us on track. So thank you for joining us.
This interview involves commercial content. The products and services featured appear as paid advertising.